Hello guys, how are you everyone? Today we explain and review Sisu, Road to Revenge, 2025, full movie. Part by part. So let's start. Part 1. What if war never truly ended for one man? What if revenge was not born from anger, but from memory? And what happens when the deadliest soldier in Europe discovers that history has unfinished business? After surviving impossible odds, mountains of bodies, explosions, gunfire, betrayal, and death itself, one man returns to a world that has changed, but his violence has not. In Sisu, Road to Revenge, 2025, the legend of Atami Korpi rises once again. But this time, the stakes are no longer gold, survival, or simple justice. This time, the battlefield becomes personal. The silent warrior who once slaughtered enemies with terrifying precision is dragged into a war that feels darker, more emotional, and infinitely more dangerous than before. And unlike the original film, this story appears to ask a chilling question. Can a man survive everything and still have something left to lose? Today, we are diving deep into Sisu, Road to Revenge, breaking down the full story, the hidden meaning behind Atami Korpi's return, the psychological layers of the film, its brutal action design, character motivations, possible historical inspirations, and why this sequel may completely redefine what audiences thought they knew about the immortal warrior. But before we go any further, there is one thing we need to understand. To understand Road to Revenge, we first need to understand the man at the center of it all. Because Atami Korpi is not a superhero. He is something far more terrifying. A survivor. The man who refused to die. Long before the explosions, before the bodies piled up, before legends spread through whispers and fear, Atami Korpi was simply a soldier. But not just any soldier. He belonged to a brutal chapter of military history, a generation shaped by impossible winters, endless violence, and the psychological scars of war. A world where survival itself became a weapon. By the time audiences first met him, Atami had already become something of a myth. A former commando. A man whispered about like a ghost. Someone whose reputation alone was enough to terrify armed enemies. In many ways, Sisu never presented him like an ordinary protagonist. He felt more like a force of nature. He barely spoke. He barely reacted. And yet somehow, every movement carried meaning. Every stare felt dangerous. Every silence felt heavier than dialogue. That was the genius behind the character. Most action heroes survive because of luck. Atami survives because pain simply stopped mattering to him. And that is where the meaning of Sisu becomes important. The concept itself represents something deeper than courage. It means determination beyond reason. The kind of resilience that exists when logic says you should stop, but something inside refuses. Not bravery. Not heroism. Something darker. Something primal. A refusal to surrender. And in many ways, Road to Revenge seems designed to test that concept more than ever before. Because survival is easy for a man like Atami. Living with memory, that is much harder. A world after war. One of the most fascinating ideas surrounding Sisu, Road to Revenge, is its timeline. Instead of remaining trapped in the exact chaos of wartime destruction, the sequel reportedly pushes the story into a period after global conflict, a world rebuilding itself from ashes. But peace after war is often an illusion. History teaches us something disturbing. When empires collapse, violence rarely disappears. It only changes uniforms. Borders move. Governments shift. Enemies wear different colors. But suffering remains. And for soldiers, peace can become more painful than combat. Because during war, survival gives purpose. Without war, what remains? That question feels central to Atami's journey. Who is a warrior when the battlefield disappears? Can a man built for destruction adapt to ordinary life? Or is violence something that permanently rewires the soul? These are the kinds of ideas that elevate Road to Revenge beyond a standard action sequel. Because beneath all the bloodshed, explosions, and brutal combat, there may be something far more emotional hiding underneath. Loss, memory, and unfinished pain. The return of a legend. One of the biggest reasons audiences became obsessed with the first Sisu film was its simplicity. The movie understood something modern action films often forget. Sometimes, audiences do not need complicated mythology. They need intensity, momentum, tension, a dangerous man, and enemies foolish enough to stand in his way. That simplicity transformed Tommy Corpy into an unforgettable cinematic icon. He felt like a mix between mythology and history, part human, part nightmare. But sequels are dangerous, especially for films built on mystery. The more you explain a character, the more power you risk taking away. That means Road to Revenge faces a challenge. How do you expand Tommy's story without destroying the mystery that made him compelling? The answer may lie in one simple shift. Make it personal. The first story was about survival. The sequel, revenge. And revenge changes everything, because revenge demands emotion. Revenge demands memory. Revenge demands pain. For perhaps the first time, audiences may see not just what Tommy can do, but why he keeps going. Why revenge changes the story. The title alone tells us something important. Road to Revenge. Not battle. Not survival. Not escape. Revenge. That word immediately changes tone. Survival stories are reactive. A person tries to stay alive. Revenge stories are proactive. A person chooses violence. That distinction matters, because it means Tommy may not simply be hunted this time. He may be the hunter. And that possibility makes the sequel infinitely more dangerous. Because the scariest version of Tommy Corpy is not the man fighting to survive. It is the man with purpose. The man who has chosen destruction. The man walking toward enemies instead of away from them. That version of Tommy feels unstoppable. But revenge also creates emotional risk. History shows revenge rarely heals people. Instead, it consumes them. So the real question becomes, will Tommy's mission save what remains of him? Or destroy the last piece of humanity still buried beneath the violence? The enemy this time. Every great action story needs opposition. And in Road to Revenge, the conflict appears larger, darker, and politically more complicated. Part 2. The Mind of an Unkillable Man, Tommy Corpy's Dark Psychology in Sisu, Road to Revenge, 2025. There are men who survive war. And then there are men who never truly leave it. Somewhere beyond the frozen horizon, beyond the graves left unnamed, beyond the smoke of forgotten violence, a man still walks. Not because he wants to. Not because he has something left to prove. But because something inside him refuses to stop breathing. The world may call him a survivor. Others may call him a killer, a ghost, a monster, a legend wrapped in blood and silence. But legends are dangerous things, because eventually, people forget the pain that created them. In Sisu, Road to Revenge, 2025, Tommy Corpy returns. Not as a man searching for gold. Not as a warrior fighting for survival. But as something infinitely more terrifying. A man haunted by memory. A man shaped by violence so deeply that peace itself feels unnatural. Because for warriors like him, the war never truly ends. It simply changes shape. And tonight, we are not just breaking down the story of Sisu, Road to Revenge. We are entering the psychology of a man who should have died long ago. A man who keeps surviving despite every wound, every loss, every impossible circumstance. But perhaps the most disturbing question hiding beneath this story is not, how does Tommy survive? The real question is, why does he keep choosing to? Because survival alone cannot explain him anymore. There has to be something deeper, something buried beneath silence, something darker than revenge. To understand Tommy Corpi, we must first understand what war does to a human mind. Chapter 1. War does not end for everyone. History tells us that when soldiers return from war, many never truly return at all. Their bodies come home. Their minds stay behind. Somewhere in explosions. Somewhere inside memory. Somewhere in screams they cannot forget. War changes people. But certain wars destroy the version of a person that existed before them. And Tommy Corpi feels like the embodiment of that destruction. Because when audiences first encountered him, something immediately stood out. He barely spoke. He barely reacted emotionally. He moved through violence with terrifying calmness. At first glance, this made him look fearless. But psychologically speaking, that silence may reveal something much darker. Because extreme trauma often reshapes emotional behavior, especially in soldiers. People exposed to relentless violence sometimes become emotionally detached. Not because they lack emotion, but because emotion becomes dangerous. Feeling too much gets people killed. Hesitation gets people killed. Fear gets people killed. And over time, the brain adapts. Emotion gets buried. Expression disappears. Human connection fades. Survival becomes instinct. That may explain why Tommy feels so distant from ordinary humanity. Not cold. Not evil. Simply disconnected. Like someone who no longer exists in the same emotional world as everyone else. In many ways, Tommy Corpi feels less like a normal human being and more like the psychological aftermath of war itself. A walking consequence. A scar that learned how to breathe. And Road to Revenge appears ready to explore that darkness more deeply than ever before. Because revenge is emotional. And emotion forces memory to return. Chapter 2. The Silence of a Deadly Man. One of the most fascinating things about Tommy Corpi is how little he speaks. In most action movies, heroes explain themselves constantly. They joke, threaten villains, deliver speeches, announce their feelings. Tommy does none of that. His silence feels intentional, heavy, uncomfortable. But silence in storytelling is powerful. Especially psychological silence, because silence forces audiences to ask questions. What is he thinking? What did he experience? Why does he seem so emotionally distant? And perhaps most importantly, what happened to him before the story even began? The less he says, the more terrifying he becomes, but also strangely tragic. Because silence can mean pain. Sometimes people stop talking because words no longer feel useful. After enough trauma, language itself becomes inadequate. How do you explain loss? How do you explain war? How do you explain becoming the last person standing? Maybe silence becomes easier. Maybe survival teaches people that actions matter more than language. And Tommy's actions speak louder than almost any character in modern action cinema. Every step feels calculated. Every movement feels practiced. Every moment feels like instinct sharpened through unimaginable suffering. He does not react like a man improvising. He reacts like someone who has lived through horror too many times before. And that makes him terrifying, because experienced violence creates terrifying calm. The calm of someone who already understands death. Script 3 cinematic opening started. Full 6,500 plus word version, dark cinematic style. Part 3. Why Sisu feels so different from Hollywood action movies. For decades, Hollywood has tried to redefine action cinema. Bigger explosions, larger franchises, more CGI, more spectacle, more noise. And somewhere along the way, many action movies stopped feeling dangerous. The violence became cleaner. The heroes became safer. The storytelling became predictable. Audiences still watched, still cheered, still bought tickets. But deep down, something was missing. Risk, tension, pain. And then Sisu arrived. A brutal Finnish survival thriller that felt completely different from modern Hollywood action movies. Not because it reinvented action cinema, but because it remembered something Hollywood forgot. Violence should feel terrifying. And in Sisu, Road to Revenge, every single frame understands that truth. This movie doesn't feel like a superhero fantasy. It feels like survival horror disguised as action cinema. Cold, silent, merciless. A film where every bullet matters, every injury matters, every decision matters, and that difference changes everything. Because while Hollywood often tries to entertain audiences with action, Sisu forces audiences to survive it emotionally. Hollywood's biggest action problem. Modern blockbuster action movies often confuse spectacle with intensity. Huge explosions fill the screen. Cities collapse. Armies fight. CGI dominates every frame, but strangely, audiences often feel emotionally disconnected from the chaos. Why? Because spectacle without consequence eventually becomes numb. When heroes survive everything effortlessly, danger disappears. And when danger disappears, tension dies. That's one of the biggest reasons Sisu feels refreshing. The movie restores consequence. Pain matters again. Injury matters again. Fear matters again. The audience constantly feels vulnerability. Even though Atami Corpi is incredibly dangerous, the film never makes him feel invincible. Exhaustion affects him. Blood loss affects him. Age affects him. And because the movie respects physical consequence, the audience emotionally invests in survival. That realism creates tension Hollywood often loses. Sisu understands the power of silence. One of the biggest differences between Sisu and Hollywood action films is dialogue. Hollywood loves explanation. Characters constantly speak, explain emotions, deliver one-liners, announce motivations, but Sisu trusts visual storytelling instead. Atami Corpi barely talks, and somehow, that silence makes him more powerful than characters delivering pages of dialogue. Why? Because silence creates mystery, and mystery creates emotional tension. The less audiences fully understand a character, the larger that character feels psychologically. Hollywood often over-explains heroes because studios fear confusion. Sisu embraces uncertainty. It trusts audiences to observe behavior instead of receiving constant exposition. And that creative confidence makes the film feel mature. Why Atami feels more real than most action heroes. Most modern action heroes are designed like power fantasies. Stylish, perfect, emotionally controlled in unrealistic ways. But Atami Corpi feels physically human. Tired, damaged, scarred. Every movement feels heavy. Every breath feels exhausted. And paradoxically, that realism makes him more terrifying. Because audiences believe him. They believe this man survived horrific experiences. They believe this man understands violence intimately. They believe this man carries decades of trauma inside his body. That emotional authenticity gives Sisu incredible psychological weight. Atami doesn't feel like a comic book character. He feels like a man shaped into something dangerous through endless suffering. And that distinction separates him from many Hollywood protagonists instantly. Hollywood action often feels too safe. One of the most important reasons Sisu feels different is unpredictability. Hollywood franchises often feel structurally safe. Audiences know heroes will survive. Audiences know emotional beats. Audiences know the pacing formula. But Sisu constantly creates uncertainty. The violence feels uncontrolled, chaotic, messy, brutal. The audience never fully relaxes because the film refuses to create emotional comfort. Every confrontation feels dangerous. Every environment feels hostile. And that emotional instability creates suspense. Not temporary excitement, real suspense. The kind that keeps audiences tense physically. The violence feels physical. Modern Hollywood action often treats violence like choreography. Stylized combat, fast editing, clean movements. But Sisu treats violence like survival. The fights feel painful, ugly, animalistic. And that realism changes the emotional impact entirely. Every injury feels meaningful. Every impact feels heavy. The audience can almost feel bones breaking. That physical realism creates discomfort, and discomfort creates immersion, because real violence should not feel effortless. It should feel exhausting, dangerous, traumatic. Sisu understands that deeply. The genius of minimalism. Hollywood often believes bigger automatically means better. More characters. More subplots, more mythology, more exposition. But Sisu succeeds because of simplicity. The movie strips storytelling down to its core elements. One man, one path, one brutal journey forward. And because the story remains focused, the emotional intensity becomes overwhelming. There's no distraction, No unnecessary emotional detours. Every scene pushes tension forward relentlessly. That minimalist structure makes the movie feel sharp, efficient, like a blade. And modern audiences respond strongly to that clarity because so many blockbusters feel bloated emotionally. Sisu treats the audience like adults. Many modern action films constantly explain themselves because studios fear losing audience attention. Sisu does the opposite. It trusts viewers. It trusts visual storytelling. It trusts atmosphere. It trusts silence. And that trust creates immersion. The movie never pauses to over-explain emotional themes. Instead, audiences feel those themes through imagery and behavior. Isolation, exhaustion, trauma, survival, all communicated visually rather than verbally. That cinematic confidence feels refreshing in an era where many films feel terrified of subtlety. The atmosphere feels dead. Now we explain Part 4. The hidden meanings behind Sisu. At first glance, Sisu, Road to Revenge looks simple. A brutal survival thriller. One man against overwhelming enemies. Violence. Revenge. Bloodshed. But beneath the explosions and brutality, there's another movie hiding quietly underneath everything. A movie about endurance, isolation, trauma, human persistence, and the terrifying psychological cost of survival. Because Sisu is filled with symbolism. Not loud symbolism. Not the kind that screams for attention. The film hides its deeper meanings inside silence, atmosphere, and visual storytelling. Every scar means something. Every landscape means something. Even the silence itself carries emotional weight. And once you begin looking beneath the surface, Sisu transforms from a revenge film into something much darker. A story about what war does to the human soul. A story about survival becoming identity. And a story about a man who may no longer remember the difference between living and simply refusing to die. What Sisu really means. The most important symbolism in the entire movie exists inside the title itself. Sisu is a Finnish concept, but translating it directly into English is almost impossible. Because Sisu is not simply courage. It's not just determination. It's something deeper. A psychological state where human beings continue forward even after reaching their absolute limit. Not confidence. Not optimism. Persistence. The kind of stubborn survival instinct that refuses surrender even when logic says defeat is inevitable. And Atomi Corpi becomes the physical embodiment of that idea. Throughout the film, he survives situations no normal human being should endure. Not because he's superhuman, but because surrender no longer exists inside him psychologically. That's what makes the character symbolic rather than merely heroic. He represents endurance itself, the refusal to collapse, the refusal to stop moving. And once audiences understand the meaning of Sisu, the entire movie changes emotionally. Because every scene stops feeling like ordinary action. Instead, it becomes symbolic survival. Atomi Corpi as the symbol of human persistence. Atomi Corpi barely speaks, and that silence matters symbolically. The film intentionally strips away normal personality traits. Why? Because Atomi is designed to feel larger than an ordinary man. He represents something primal, ancient, the raw survival instinct buried deep inside human beings. The instinct that appears only during extreme suffering. And throughout the movie, he feels less like a normal protagonist and more like a force of nature. A walking manifestation of endurance. That's why the film rarely pauses to explain his emotions directly. The filmmakers want audiences to project meaning onto him. Pain, trauma, determination, rage, survival. Different viewers see different things inside him, and that ambiguity makes the symbolism stronger. The landscape symbolizes emotional death. The environment in Sisu is one of the film's most powerful symbolic elements. The landscapes feel empty, cold, silent, almost lifeless, and that atmosphere mirrors Atomi's psychological state perfectly. The world itself feels emotionally exhausted, destroyed by violence, stripped of warmth, just like the protagonist. The endless roads symbolize isolation. The gray skies symbolize hopelessness. The frozen landscapes symbolize emotional numbness. Even when the world appears beautiful visually, it still feels emotionally dead. And that contrast creates haunting atmosphere throughout the film. Because Sisu constantly suggests something important. War doesn't simply destroy cities. It destroys emotional warmth itself. Gold as a symbol of purpose. One of the most fascinating symbolic elements in Sisu is gold. On the surface, gold represents survival, value, motivation. But symbolically, it represents something deeper. Purpose. A reason to keep moving forward. Throughout history, humans have survived unbearable suffering because of purpose. Hope, love, family, faith, revenge. Something that justifies endurance. And in Sisu, gold becomes symbolic of that emotional drive. Not greed. Direction. Without purpose, survival eventually feels meaningless. And Atomi behaves like someone who lost almost everything except forward movement itself. The gold becomes one of the last remaining symbols of personal meaning in his shattered world. That's why protecting it feels so psychologically important to him. Fire as symbolic transformation. Fire appears constantly throughout Sisu. Explosions, burning landscapes, flames consuming environments, and symbolically, fire represents transformation, destruction creating rebirth. But in Sisu, the transformation feels dark. Atomi was not reborn into peace. He was reforged into survival. The violence transformed him psychologically, burned away softness, burned away fear, burned away emotional vulnerability. What remained was endurance. Cold, relentless, unstoppable endurance. And the repeated fire imagery reinforces that idea visually. Every explosion feels symbolic, as if the world itself is constantly being consumed by violence. Why silence is symbolic? Silence in Sisu is not just stylistic. It represents emotional emptiness, trauma, isolation. After extreme suffering, Many people lose connection to ordinary communication. Words begin feeling meaningless. And Atami embodies that psychological state completely. He rarely speaks because emotionally, he already exists somewhere beyond ordinary social interaction. The silence also forces audiences into discomfort. Without constant dialogue, viewers become hyper-aware of breathing, footsteps, atmosphere, tension. And that sensory awareness creates immersion. The audience begins experiencing the world the same way Atami does. Coldly, carefully, silently. That's powerful symbolic storytelling. The enemies represent more than people. The enemies in Sisu are symbolic too. They represent cruelty, greed, power, oppression, arrogance. They constantly underestimate Atami because powerful systems often underestimate survivors. That theme appears throughout human history repeatedly. People in control assume broken individuals will remain broken, but sometimes suffering creates resistance instead. And Sisu turns that idea into mythology. The enemies believe numbers guarantee victory. Weapons guarantee superiority. Authority guarantees control. But Atami represents something impossible to dominate psychologically. Pure refusal. And that's why the enemies gradually stop seeing him as human. Now we explain Part 5. How Sisu, Road to Revenge, 2025, changed modern action movies. For years, action cinema kept getting louder. Bigger explosions, larger franchises, endless CGI battles, entire cities collapsing every 20 minutes. Hollywood believed spectacle was the future. And for a while, audiences enjoyed it. But eventually, something strange happened. The bigger action movies became, the less danger audiences actually felt. Violence became weightless. Heroes became untouchable. Action became choreography instead of survival. And slowly, modern audiences started craving something different. Something raw. Something painful. Something that felt real again. That's where films like Sisu entered the conversation. Not as traditional blockbusters, not as superhero spectacles, but as survival cinema. A darker form of action storytelling where pain matters, fear matters, exhaustion matters, and survival itself becomes the true objective. And with Sisu, Road to Revenge, that evolution reaches another level entirely. Because this movie doesn't just continue modern survival cinema. It perfects many of the reasons audiences became obsessed with the genre in the first place. What is survival cinema? Most action movies are about victory. Survival cinema is different. Survival stories are not focused on domination. They're focused on endurance. The protagonist is usually overwhelmed, outnumbered, injured, trapped. And instead of feeling like an unstoppable superhero, they feel vulnerable, human. That vulnerability creates emotional tension, because survival cinema forces audiences to ask a terrifying question. How far can a human being go before finally breaking? That question exists at the center of Sisu. Tommy Corpy is dangerous, but he's also exhausted, aging, scarred, bleeding. And because the movie constantly reminds audiences of his physical suffering, every victory feels earned. That realism separates survival cinema from ordinary action spectacle. Why audiences grew tired of traditional action movies. For decades, mainstream action cinema followed predictable formulas. The hero jokes during danger. Explosions become entertainment. Violence feels clean. Consequences disappear. And eventually, audiences stopped feeling tension. Because tension requires uncertainty. If viewers believe the hero is untouchable, fear disappears completely. That's why survival cinema became increasingly popular. It restored danger. In survival films, injuries matter. Pain changes behavior. Exhaustion affects decisions. And audiences emotionally reconnect with violence because it feels physical again. Sisu understands this perfectly. Every wound feels heavy. Every confrontation feels risky. Every scene feels unstable. The audience never fully relaxes. And that emotional pressure creates immersion modern blockbusters often lose. The DNA of survival cinema. Survival cinema has existed for decades, but modern survival films evolved into something darker and more psychological. Older action heroes often represented confidence. Modern survival protagonists represent endurance. That's a huge difference emotionally. Characters like Mad Max, John Rambo, the protagonists of The Revenant, even modern revenge figures like John Wick, all share survival DNA. But Sisu strips the formula down even further. Minimal dialogue, minimal emotional exposition, minimal distraction, only survival, only movement, only persistence. And that simplicity gives the movie primal energy, almost mythological energy, like watching an ancient survival story reborn inside modern cinema. Why Sisu feels more brutal than Hollywood action. Hollywood action movies often romanticize violence, stylized choreography, fast editing, cool one-liners. But Sisu treats violence differently. The violence feels ugly, heavy, painful, chaotic. And that realism matters psychologically. Because audiences instinctively understand real violence is horrifying. Not elegant, not cinematic. Horrifying. Sisu restores that emotional discomfort. Every fight feels desperate. Every injury feels dangerous. The protagonist survives through adaptation, not invincibility. And that physical realism creates fear. The audience starts experiencing combat emotionally rather than casually consuming spectacle. That's one of the biggest reasons survival cinema resonates so deeply today. The modern audience wants pain to matter again. One reason survival cinema exploded in popularity is emotional authenticity. Modern audiences are exhausted by consequence-free action. People want pain to matter again. They want survival to feel difficult. They want heroes who bleed, who suffer, who struggle. And Sisu gives audiences exactly that. Atami Corpi is terrifying not because he's superhuman, but because he refuses to stop despite overwhelming suffering. That persistence becomes emotionally powerful, because audiences connect to endurance more than perfection. Everyone understands exhaustion. Everyone understands pain. Everyone understands continuing forward despite emotional damage. And survival cinema transforms those universal emotions into visual storytelling. Sisu understands atmosphere. One of the defining traits of modern survival cinema is atmosphere. The world itself becomes hostile. And Sisu creates one of the coldest atmospheres in modern action filmmaking. The landscapes feel dead. Gray skies, silent roads, destroyed environments. Everything feels emotionally frozen. That atmosphere reinforces the psychological themes perfectly. This is not a world filled with hope. It's a world shaped by violence. And Atami Corpi feels like a natural product of that brutal environment, like a ghost wandering through the ruins of humanity itself. That immersive atmosphere separates survival cinema from ordinary blockbuster action immediately. The rise of silent protagonists. Modern audiences became fascinated with silent protagonists for a reason. Silence creates mystery. Mystery creates tension. And tension creates myth. Characters like Atami Corpi barely speak, yet dominate scenes completely. Why? Because silence forces audiences to observe behavior rather than dialogue. We study movement, breathing, eye contact, stillness, and gradually, the character becomes larger psychologically, almost legendary. Survival cinema understands that silence often feels more dangerous than speech, because calmness during violence terrifies human beings instinctively. And Sisu weaponizes silence masterfully. Why survival movies? Part 6. Every brutal kill explained. Most action movies want audiences to cheer during violence. Sisu, Road to Revenge wants audiences to fear it. That's the first thing you notice while watching the film. The combat doesn't feel heroic. It doesn't feel clean. It doesn't even feel cinematic in the traditional Hollywood sense. It feels desperate, efficient, animalistic. Every attack feels designed for one purpose only: survival. And that's exactly what makes the violence in Sisu so disturbing. Because beneath the blood and brutality, the film quietly follows real survival psychology. Every kill tells a story. Every movement reveals experience. Every brutal confrontation exposes how terrifying a human being becomes after years of surviving violence. Atami Corpi does not fight like a superhero. He fights like a man who learned one horrifying lesson a long time ago. Hesitation gets people killed. And once audiences understand that mentality, the entire movie changes emotionally. The violence stops feeling entertaining. Instead, it starts feeling inevitable, like watching a predator survive inside a world where morality already collapsed. Why the combat feels different. Most Hollywood action scenes are built around spectacle. stylized choreography, perfect movement, fast editing. But Sisu approaches combat differently. The violence feels physical, heavy, messy. Every encounter looks painful, and that realism creates emotional tension instantly. Because real survival combat is not elegant. It's chaotic, fast, brutal, and usually decided by whoever adapts first. Atami understands adaptation better than everyone around him. That's why every fight scene feels psychologically one-sided even when he's physically overwhelmed. He thinks differently, moves differently, kills differently. The enemies often fight emotionally. Atami fights practically, and practical violence is terrifying. The psychology of efficiency. One of the most disturbing aspects of Atami's combat style is efficiency. Nothing is wasted. No unnecessary movement. No flashy attacks. No dramatic pauses. Every action serves survival. That mentality reveals years of experience. Real survivors conserve energy, because prolonged violence exhausts the human body quickly. And throughout the film, Atami behaves like someone who fully understands physical limitation. He doesn't fight to impress. He fights to eliminate threats immediately. That efficiency becomes horrifying over time, because audiences realize they are not watching emotional combat anymore. They are watching calculated survival behavior, almost instinctive, like a predator eliminating danger automatically. Environmental combat, using the world as a weapon. One of the smartest tactical elements in Sisu is environmental combat. Atami constantly uses surroundings strategically. Terrain, objects, weather, isolation. Everything becomes part of survival. This is extremely realistic psychologically. Experienced survivors understand something important. The environment itself can become a weapon. And throughout the movie, Atami weaponizes space brilliantly. Narrow areas limit enemy numbers. Darkness creates uncertainty. Silence creates fear. Even movement through terrain feels tactical. Nothing feels accidental. Every survival decision appears shaped by experience. That realism gives the violence incredible authenticity. Why fear becomes a weapon. One of Atami's deadliest tactical advantages is psychological warfare. At first, the enemies underestimate him. They see an older man, a survivor, a target, but gradually, fear spreads through their ranks. And once fear appears, discipline collapses. This is psychologically accurate. Fear destroys coordination. Fear creates hesitation. Fear causes human beings to abandon logic. And Atami unconsciously weaponizes that fear constantly. His survival becomes terrifying. The more punishment he endures, the more unnatural he appears. Eventually, enemies stop fighting strategically. They start panicking emotionally, and panic during violence is fatal. The brutal realism of close combat. Close combat in Sisu feels horrifying because it lacks cinematic glamour. The fights are fast, ugly, desperate. Real close-range violence often depends on aggression, timing, and adaptability rather than beauty. And Atami constantly demonstrates brutal understanding of those principles. He attacks weaknesses immediately, uses momentum, targets vulnerability. There's no honor in his combat style, only survival. That's what makes it believable, because experienced survivors rarely fight fairly. Fairness disappears during life-or-death situations. Efficiency becomes morality, and Sisu communicates that philosophy through every confrontation. Why Atami never looks panicked. One of the scariest details in the film is emotional control. Even during extreme danger, Atami rarely panics. That calmness creates enormous tension, because calm violence feels unnatural to most people. Humans instinctively expect emotional reactions during combat: fear, anger, chaos. But Atami behaves differently. Cold, focused, precise. That psychological control suggests years of adaptation. A man who has survived enough violence to normalize it internally. And once audiences understand that, the character becomes far more disturbing. The enemies keep making the same mistake. Throughout the movie, the enemies repeat one fatal error. They underestimate experience. They believe numbers guarantee victory. Weapons guarantee superiority. But survival experience changes combat psychology completely. Atami understands pain better, fear better, timing better, violence better, and that accumulated knowledge gives him enormous advantage despite overwhelming odds. The enemies fight like ordinary men. Atami fights like someone who already survived hell repeatedly. That difference becomes the true battlefield. Not physical strength, psychological adaptation. Weapons as symbols of survival. The weapons in Sisu never feel decorative. Every tool feels functional, necessary, practical. That realism matters. Modern action movies often romanticize weapons stylistically. Sisu treats them as survival extensions. Nothing flashy, nothing excessive, just brutal utility. And that grounded approach reinforces the movie's atmosphere constantly. Violence here does not feel exciting. It feels necessary. That emotional tone changes the impact of every kill. Why the violence feels so exhausting. Most action movies energize audiences during combat. Sisu exhausts them intentionally. Part 7: The Dark World of Sisu. The scariest thing about Sisu, Road to Revenge, is not the violence. It's the emptiness surrounding it, the silence, the cold, the feeling that the world itself has already died emotionally long before the story even begins. Most action movies create excitement. Sisu creates dread. A heavy, suffocating atmosphere where every road feels abandoned, every landscape feels haunted, and every human being looks spiritually exhausted. This is not a world filled with hope. This is a world shaped by survival. And survival has stripped away almost everything human. That's what makes Sisu feel different from ordinary action cinema. The movie doesn't simply show brutality. It traps audiences inside a dying world where brutality became norma ppa, a world where silence feels dangerous. A world where warmth feels forgotten. A world where a man like Atami Korpi no longer seems unnatural. He feels inevitable. And that idea becomes increasingly terrifying the deeper the film pulls audiences into its atmosphere. The world feels emotionally dead. There's a difference between destruction and emotional death. Many post-war movies show ruined environments, destroyed buildings, smoke, burned landscapes. But Sisu goes further. The world doesn't just look damaged. It feels spiritually empty. The roads feel abandoned by humanity itself. The landscapes feel cold enough to erase emotion. Even moments without violence feel uncomfortable. That atmosphere matters deeply because environment shapes emotion. And throughout the movie, the environment constantly reinforces one terrifying truth. This world has suffered too much for too long. Everything feels exhausted, including the people living inside it. Why the silence feels so haunting. Modern action films are terrified of silence. They constantly fill scenes with dialogue, music, noise, and explanation. Sisu does the opposite. The movie embraces silence aggressively. And that silence becomes emotionally unsettling. Because silence forces audiences to focus. Breathing, footsteps, wind, distant movement. The absence of sound creates tension naturally. Human beings instinctively distrust silence during dangerous situations. And Sisu weaponizes that psychological discomfort constantly. Every quiet moment feels like a warning. Every pause feels threatening, as if violence could erupt at any second. That's why the atmosphere feels so oppressive. The movie never allows audiences to feel emotionally safe. Tommy Corpy looks like a ghost inside this world. Tommy doesn't feel like a normal protagonist. He feels like something left behind after the end of humanity. A remnant. A survivor wandering through emotional ruins. And the film visually reinforces this constantly. He often appears isolated inside massive empty landscapes, small against endless cold environments, alone against dead silence. The imagery makes him feel ghost-like, not supernatural, psychologically disconnected, like someone who survived war physically, but never escaped it emotionally. And that haunting quality becomes one of the movie's strongest emotional elements. Because beneath the brutal violence, Tommy feels tragic. Not heroic. Tragic. The coldness of the environment. Coldness dominates Sisu visually. Gray skies. Frozen landscapes. Muted colors. Everything feels emotionally frozen. And symbolically, that coldness mirrors trauma itself. Trauma creates emotional numbness, distance, disconnection, and the film transforms those psychological emotions into visual atmosphere brilliantly. Warmth barely exists inside this world. Even human interaction feels cold, hostile, suspicious, as if survival itself destroyed ordinary emotional connection completely. That emotional coldness makes the world feel believable, because prolonged violence changes societies psychologically, not just physically. Why the world feels lonely. One of the most powerful aspects of Sisu is isolation. The movie constantly creates enormous empty space, long roads, endless wilderness, massive silent environments. And that isolation creates emotional discomfort. Human beings are social creatures. We instinctively fear abandonment, separation, loneliness. And Sisu amplifies those fears constantly through cinematography. Tommy rarely feels connected to anyone emotionally. Even when surrounded by people, he seems distant, disconnected, as if part of him already belongs to another world entirely. That loneliness becomes haunting over time. The atmosphere of post-war exhaustion. Most war films focus on combat itself. Sisu focuses on what remains afterward. Exhaustion, emotional collapse, spiritual emptiness. The world feels tired. Not temporarily tired. Civilization-level tired. As if humanity itself no longer remembers peace. That atmosphere changes the meaning of every violent encounter. Because violence no longer feels shocking inside this world. It feels routine, expected, normal. And that normalization of brutality becomes deeply disturbing. Why the violence feels so dark. The violence in Sisu feels different because the atmosphere surrounding it feels hopeless. Most action movies create excitement during combat. Sisu creates dread. The audience never feels emotionally triumphant. Instead, every violent moment increases emotional heaviness. Because the movie constantly reminds viewers that nobody truly wins in this world. Survival itself feels painful. And that emotional darkness gives the violence psychological weight. Every fight scene feels less like entertainment, and more like another symptom of a dying world. The landscapes feel like emotional mirrors. The environments in Sisu mirror Atami's internal psychology perfectly. Cold, silent, scarred, empty, just like him. The film rarely separates character from environment emotionally. Instead, Atami almost feels created by the world around him, a product of endless survival. A man shaped by harsh landscapes and endless violence until softness disappeared completely. That connection between character and environment creates immersive atmosphere throughout the film. Why the movie feels so heavy. Some movies feel entertaining. Sisu feels heavy, emotionally heavy, and much of that weight comes from pacing. The movie allows scenes to breathe, allows silence to linger, allows tension to build naturally. There's no rush toward constant stimulation. The filmmakers trust atmosphere, and that confidence creates emotional pressure. Audiences feel trapped inside the world rather than simply observing it. That immersion becomes exhausting in the best possible way. Part 8. How Sisu created a new action hero. For decades, action heroes followed the same formula. Confident, charismatic, loud. Men who walked into danger with perfect one-liners and impossible certainty. From classic Hollywood icons to modern blockbuster superheroes, audiences became used to protagonists who felt larger than life in obvious ways. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Modern audiences stopped connecting deeply with perfect heroes. The world became more exhausting, more uncertain, more emotionally heavy, and viewers slowly began gravitating toward different kinds of protagonists. Not untouchable heroes, survivors, broken men, silent men, characters who looked like they had actually suffered. And that's exactly where Sisu entered the conversation. Because Atami Corpi doesn't feel like a traditional action hero at all. He barely talks. He doesn't try to look cool. He doesn't perform for the audience. He survives. That's it. And strangely, that simplicity made him feel more powerful than many modern blockbuster protagonists combined. Because Sisu, Road to Revenge didn't just continue action cinema. It quietly created a new type of action hero entirely. One shaped not by confidence, but by endurance. The death of the classic action hero. Older action heroes represented fantasy, strength, confidence, control. They dominated every situation emotionally. Even during danger, they remained stylish and charismatic. And for years, audiences loved that formula. But eventually, the formula started feeling artificial. Too polished. Too safe. Too disconnected from real human struggle. Modern audiences began craving something more emotionally believable. Heroes who bled. Heroes who suffered. Heroes who looked exhausted by life itself. And that shift completely changed action storytelling. Suddenly, vulnerability became more interesting than perfection. That's why characters like Atami Corpi resonate so strongly. Because he doesn't feel manufactured. He feels damaged. And damage feels real. Why Atami Corpi feels different. Most action protagonists still behave like celebrities inside their own movies. They constantly talk, constantly explain themselves, constantly remind audiences how cool they are. Atami does the opposite. He almost disappears into silence, and that silence becomes powerful, because audiences begin studying him differently. His eyes, his movement, his exhaustion, his scars. Instead of listening to dialogue, viewers observe survival. That creates realism, and realism creates emotional connection. Atami doesn't feel like a performance. He feels like a man shaped by endless suffering into something dangerous. That emotional authenticity makes him unforgettable. The rise of the silent protagonist. Silence has become increasingly powerful in modern action cinema. Why? Because silence creates mystery, and mystery creates psychological tension. Characters who talk constantly reveal everything immediately, but silent characters force audiences to project meaning onto them. That's exactly why Atami feels larger than life despite saying so little. The less he explains himself, the more mythological he becomes. And Sisu understands this perfectly. Every silent scene increases emotional weight. Every quiet reaction deepens character. Because silence forces viewers to engage actively rather than passively consuming exposition. That cinematic confidence makes Atami feel timeless. Why modern audiences connect to exhausted heroes. Atami Corpi constantly looks tired. Not weak. Tired. And that detail matters enormously. Modern audiences are emotionally exhausted themselves. Life feels heavy. Stress feels constant. Uncertainty feels endless. And protagonists like Atami embody emotional persistence. Not optimism. Persistence. The refusal to stop moving despite exhaustion. That emotional energy feels deeply relatable psychologically. Viewers don't connect because they relate to violence. They connect because they understand endurance. And Sisu transforms endurance into mythology. The difference between invincibility and resilience. Older action heroes often felt invincible. Atami feels resilient instead. That distinction changes everything emotionally. Invincible characters rarely create fear because audiences never believe they can truly fail. Resilient characters feel human. They suffer, bleed, struggle, but continue anyway. And that persistence creates emotional investment. Atami survives not because he avoids pain, but because pain no longer stops him. That's terrifying, and strangely inspiring at the same time, because resilience feels psychologically real in ways invincibility never can. Why Atami feels more like a survivor than a hero. Traditional heroes fight for ideals, justice, honor, glory. Atami fights to continue existing. That survival mentality changes his entire presence. He doesn't posture emotionally. He doesn't seek admiration. He doesn't behave heroically in the traditional cinematic sense. He adapts, endures, moves forward. And survival instinct creates fascinating protagonists because it feels primal. Ancient, human beings instinctively understand survival psychology. Fear, pain, persistence. And Sisu builds its hero entirely around those emotions instead of traditional action fantasy. The world created this type of hero. Atami Corpi could not exist in colorful superhero worlds. He belongs to harsh environments, cold landscapes, violent worlds, emotionally dead places, and that environmental connection matters. Because modern action heroes increasingly reflect the emotional state of modern audiences. People no longer trust perfect systems, perfect heroes, perfect morality. Characters shaped by trauma feel more believable now. And Atami represents that evolution perfectly. He doesn't feel untouched by violence. He feels created by it. Why? Part 9. Why Sisu feels like a nightmare you can't escape. Most action movies are designed to entertain audiences. Sisu, Road to Revenge does something far stranger. It traps audiences inside fear. Not jump-scare horror. Not supernatural horror. Psychological horror. The kind of fear that slowly crawls under your skin while watching. The feeling that something inside this world is deeply wrong. That survival itself has become unnatural. That violence has repeated for so long, humanity no longer remembers how to exist without it. And that's why Sisu feels less like a traditional action film, and more like a nightmare disguised as survival cinema. A cold nightmare where silence feels dangerous, where every road leads deeper into suffering, where the protagonist himself slowly stops feeling human. Because beneath all the explosions and brutality, Sisu is psychologically terrifying, not because of monsters, but because it understands something darker. Human beings can become monsters through survival alone. The fear of endless survival. One of the deepest fears hidden inside Sisu is repetition. Violence never truly ends. Pain never fully stops. Survival continues endlessly. And that psychological exhaustion creates nightmare energy throughout the movie. Most stories promise resolution, victory, peace. But Sisu rarely feels hopeful emotionally. Even during moments of success, exhaustion remains. The audience never fully relaxes, because the film constantly suggests survival itself is becoming a curse, and that emotional pressure transforms the movie into psychological horror slowly over time. Why Atami feels like a horror character. At first, Atami Corpi appears like a survival protagonist, but gradually, the film changes perspective emotionally. The enemies stop seeing him as human, and audiences begin understanding why. He survives too much, endures too much, moves too calmly through violence. That persistence becomes frightening, especially from the enemy perspective. Imagine encountering someone who refuses to stop no matter what happens to them physically. Someone silent, emotionless, unrelenting. That's not how ordinary people behave. And the movie weaponizes that discomfort brilliantly. Atami slowly transforms from protagonist into nightmare figure. Not supernatural. Psychological. The living embodiment of unstoppable survival instinct. The world feels cursed. One reason Sisu feels haunting is atmosphere. The world itself feels wrong. Empty roads, cold skies, dead silence. Everything feels emotionally poisoned somehow, as if violence infected the environment permanently. And that atmosphere creates dread constantly. Even before combat begins, audiences feel tension, because the world never feels safe. The environments feel abandoned emotionally. Not peaceful. Abandoned. That distinction matters, because peaceful silence relaxes audiences. Abandoned silence terrifies them. Why the movie feels so claustrophobic despite open landscapes. One of the strangest achievements in Sisu is emotional claustrophobia. The environments are huge. Wide landscapes, endless roads, open wilderness. Yet the movie feels suffocating. Why? Because danger exists everywhere psychologically. The audience never feels escape. No matter how open the world appears physically, emotionally it feels trapped. That's nightmare logic. Dreams often create impossible emotional spaces, massive environments that still feel inescapable. And Sisu recreates that sensation perfectly. The horror of silence. Silence becomes terrifying in Sisu because it creates anticipation. Human beings fear what they cannot predict. And silence removes emotional certainty completely. No music guiding emotion. No dialogue explaining safety. Only stillness. Waiting. The audience becomes hyper-aware of every sound, breathing, movement, wind, and gradually, silence itself begins feeling threatening. That psychological tension transforms ordinary scenes into horror sequences without needing supernatural elements. Why the violence feels disturbing. Many action movies glamorize violence. Sisu makes violence feel wrong, painful, messy, emotionally exhausting, and that realism creates discomfort. The audience stops enjoying combat casually. Instead, viewers endure it psychologically alongside the characters. Every injury feels heavy. Every confrontation feels desperate. That emotional realism pushes the movie closer to horror territory than traditional action, because horror often depends on helplessness. And despite Atami's terrifying abilities, the movie constantly reminds audiences how vulnerable human bodies truly are. The nightmare of persistence. One of the film's darkest psychological ideas is persistence beyond normal human limits. Atami keeps moving through injuries that should stop ordinary people. And gradually, that persistence becomes horrifying instead of inspiring. Because humans instinctively expect pain to create surrender eventually. When someone ignores pain completely, they stop feeling emotionally human. That's why enemies begin fearing him almost supernaturally. Not because he has powers, because his endurance violates normal psychological expectations. And humans fear what they cannot emotionally understand. Why the enemies feel panicked. Fear spreads through the enemies slowly throughout the movie. At first, they behave confidently, aggressively, but once Atami survives repeated impossible situations, panic begins replacing logic. This is psychologically realistic. Human beings rely on predictable reality to remain emotionally stable. When reality stops behaving normally, fear escalates rapidly. And Atami becomes terrifying because he destroys predictability completely. No injury stops him. No intimidation affects him. No suffering changes his direction. That emotional abnormality turns him into a nightmare
Now we
figure
explain
psychologically.
Part 10, the brutal philosophy
fear of
emotional
Sisu.
numbness.
But Sisu,
Atami
Road to
rarely
Revenge
shows
asks
strong
something
emotion
far darker.
outwardly.
What
And that
happens to a
emotional
human
numbness
being after
becomes
surviving
deeply
too much?
unsettling.
Because
That question
emotions
lives beneath
create
every frame of the
familiarity,
movie.
connection,
Beneath the
humanity.
explosions,
Without
beneath
visible
the
emotional
brutality,
reactions,
beneath the
people
silence,
feel unreadable. Because Sisu
dangerous.
is not really about action. It's about endurance, about suffering, about the terrifying psychological transformation caused by endless survival. And the deeper you look into the film, the more philosophical it becomes. This is not a story about glory. It's not even truly a story about revenge. It's a story about human persistence pushed beyond natural emotional limits. A story about a man who continues moving forward long after ordinary people would collapse physically, mentally, spiritually. And that idea becomes both inspiring and horrifying at the same time. Because Sisu quietly suggests something deeply uncomfortable. The human survival instinct may be powerful enough to destroy humanity itself. What does it mean to keep going? At the center of Sisu exists one philosophical idea. Movement. Forward movement. Atami Corpi never truly stops. No matter how brutal the world becomes. No matter how much pain he suffers. No matter how hopeless survival appears. He continues. And the film forces audiences to confront an unsettling question. Why? What drives human beings to continue enduring suffering? Hope, instinct, purpose, or simply refusal? The movie never gives a direct answer, and that ambiguity makes the philosophy stronger. Because different viewers interpret Atami differently. To some, he represents courage. To others, obsession. To others, trauma transformed into survival instinct. That uncertainty gives the character enormous existential depth. The philosophy of Sisu itself. Sisu is more than determination. It's a philosophy of persistence beyond reason, continuing after exhaustion, continuing after fear, continuing after logic itself says surrender would make more sense. And philosophically, that idea becomes complicated, because persistence sounds heroic. But what happens when persistence becomes endless? When survival becomes identity? When a person no longer remembers how to exist outside struggle? That's the darker side of Sisu. Tommy survives magnificently, but the film constantly hints at enormous psychological cost beneath that survival. The world of Sisu has lost its humanity. One of the most philosophical